you need Congress to start working as a branch against the presidency, which is good constitutionally. It sounds like it's bad, but it's good. Or you would need a president who willingly puts more shackles on his power or her power and forces Congress to take some of the power that has been collected into the executive branch.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, a senior fellow with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks. Today, on this episode, is our great privilege to introduce Sarah Burns, who is going to talk about her new book, The Politics of War Powers, the Theory and History of Presidential Unilateralism. So the guiding question for this conversation is going to be how the president has really been, presidents have been able to decide when the United States go to war, really in many, many instances, without Congress deliberating or even declaring war. And secondly, what effect has this had on the constitutional principles of separation of powers and checks and balances? So those are the questions we're going to really focus on and try to answer today. By way of introductions, Sarah Burns is an associate professor of political science at Rochester Institute of Technology, and she teaches at the Ashbrook Center's Master's Program for Teachers. Sarah, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, let's jump right in. My first question is really on laying kind of the theory and constitutionalism of this topic. And so I want to ask you, what is the proper constitutional balance between the Congress on one hand and the presidency on the other with regard to war powers, and how are they supposed to function?
Yeah, great question, thanks. It really goes back to the way that James Madison described it in the Federalist Papers when he said ambition is supposed to be counteracting ambition. And what he means by this when he's describing it in Federalist 51 is that you need to have each branch have an interest in what's going on in their branch and ensure that they're guarding their powers. So you see that the founders did a very good job of distributing the war powers across both of the branches. And what they were trying to do is really lock them into a conversation with each other that can get contentious, can be a battle between the two of them, because Congress is supposed to say, I don't really know if we need to use the military to solve this problem. And the president is then supposed to say, well, this is the reason why, I'm trying to convince you why it is we need the military. And in that conversation, he and perhaps eventually she is supposed to be convincing Congress and supposed to be saying, I'm making a case for war. And Congress is then supposed to say, that's a good case. And, we'll give you the money and the troops that you need. And if he doesn't make a good case or Congress is just not convinced, then you don't have war, right? And so that should be the real battle the balance is you have a battle between the branches if they don't agree, and consensus between the branches if they do agree on the necessity of a military operation.
Yeah, I love that, and that really supports the idea of checks and balances, right? And I love the way you put it. It's a conversation, right? It's deliberation, right? In our system of self-government, these political branches are supposed to talk and debate and converse about policy and the law and public good, and going to war is obviously one of the most important things and jobs that it does with the greatest impact on its citizens. And so that's a really important dialogue to have.
Yeah, and it's also, we see in the two branches, they have different qualities and different competencies, right? So Congress is supposed to be slow and deliberative and kind of plodding, and the presidency, conversely, is supposed to be energetic and quick and, kind of frenzied in movement. And bringing those things together, you get a nice balance. And so the checks and balances are true, but it's also the different nature of the power in Congress versus the nature of the power in the executive. Bringing them together into this dialogue makes it much more likely that you're going to have positive results, positive policy, good policy, where you know where you're going with the military and what you're going to do with it, right? Which is a really good way, I think, of deciding what to do in the realm of war, right? You don't want to just say, well, go ahead, we'll see if we win this war, and if we don't, what's more blood and treasure, right? That's not how we should be developing policy.
Right. Well, your book is just chock full of very, very interesting examples. So let's start looking at some of those examples. And looking at the 19th century, okay, you describe a few imbalances there between the branches, but by and large, you argue that the constitutional balance of powers really does function properly from the early republic up through the Spanish-American War. So maybe you can just briefly talk about that period and why the powers were balanced so well.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really important to think of the U.S. not as this isolated nation that wasn't doing anything in the 19th century, and then all of a sudden in the 20th century just exploded onto the international stage. In the 19th century, we're fighting the British, the Spanish, to a certain extent the French. I mean, we're fighting the great empires, we're fighting the Mexicans, we're doing all sorts of things in terms of war besides the Civil War, and that's really shaping the way that these branches were supposed to interact, and they actually did, right? So we see that not only is it in theory that the branches work together this way, we also see in practice they worked very, very well, where the president took his case to Congress, explained to Congress what it is that he wanted to do. Congress then thought about it, right? And in most cases made the right decision. In the Mexican-American War, definitely Congress should have been like, what are you doing, Polk? This is a terrible idea. Absolutely no, we're not giving you any money, we're not giving you any troops, but I digress. So president brings his case to Congress, Congress thinks about it, talks about it, says to the president, this is what we can give you, and we're off, right? And then we have the war, and the president continuously goes back to Congress, continues to make his case to Congress. Congress continues to deliberate about the case for war and continues to support it or tries to shift policy as needs be.
And so the unilateral presidential exercise of war powers really seems to become more problematic during and after World War I, with Woodrow Wilson making claims to spread democracy and going to war to make the world safe for democracy. And then after the war, he tries to establish a new world order with the League of Nations to enforce the peace and kind of create this lasting peace among all the nations of the world. So what is so problematic about World War I?
Yeah, it's a pivotal point. Obviously, it's called the Great War in Britain. It's one of these moments in history where you actually see the world really dropped into horrible fighting that should be a moment where we say, okay, maybe as a human race, we can rise above or get past this horrible way of interacting with each other that has been a part of human nature since the beginning of civilization, right? And so the problem with this idea, and the problem with Wilson's understanding of this idea that we can make the world safe for democracy, is that he thinks you can eradicate it, you can get rid of this part of human nature. And by shaping the world in a certain way and making everybody democratic, will suddenly live in this utopic world of democracies where we're all just friendly and kind to each other. And it'll just be basically the US's relationship with Britain, but writ large, right? Like everyone will kind of interact that way, and we'll just have a little, kerfuffles every now and then. And so this is just a fundamental denial of human nature, right? How it is that people interact with each other. And the desire to kind of pivot in this way, and the idea that you can eliminate human nature in this respect is just so hubristic, right? Like this is just a level of ambition that needs to be checked, right? That needs to be brought back to earth, brought back to reality, that you can do a lot of things to try and stop wars from breaking out, and that's a really good idea, and we should definitely make those steps. But as Horace said, I think this is from Horace, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but she always comes back. So that's the really big problem with the Wilsonian vision of the world, is you can't get rid of human nature. You can't get rid of the warlike part of human beings. You can only kind of try and contain it and keep it small as possible.
Right, and this really continues during another watershed moment with FDR and sort of the lead up to war and then the actual fighting in World War II. And another moment for unilateralism by the executive, right? And so how does FDR contribute to presidents engaging in war without congressional authorization?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the problem with FDR is, you can never leave him, right? He's just this pivotal figure in American history. He's this pivotal president. He's dynamic. He's this powerful speaker who just has a totally different vision for how the US should run, what the US government should do. And he's given power or gets power at a time when there are not one, but two major crises, right? So first you have the Great Depression, which is a once in a lifetime economic crisis. And then you have World War II, that in theory should have been a once in a lifetime war, but you're somewhat on the heels of World War I. And so giving this incredibly impressive politician power at a time when there are such immense crises to meet, you're going to have him fill the role, right? Expand dramatically his own powers in an effort to meet these crises. And constitutionally, that makes sense, right? You do actually want the presidency to expand at a moment of crisis. Perhaps not as much with an economic crisis, but definitely in a crisis as large as World War II, you want a powerful president. But after that, you want it to come back to earth. You want it to contract back down. But FDR, as I say in the book, he kind of broke part of our democracy in order to save it. And I think to me, it's debatable whether that was necessary, right? Did he have to expand the presidency to the size that he did? It's, like I said, a point of debate, but he did expand the presidency, and he was to a certain extent given that leash by Congress. And afterwards, we just see it's kind of like the floodgates had opened, or Pandora's box had opened, to just keep using different metaphors. And so once that had happened, I think it was really hard for Congress to reconstrain or to put parameters back on presidential power after that point.
And it doesn't, right? And so the Cold War becomes this real ultimate turning point, as you describe in the book, in which presidents go to war based upon authority from the UN, from the new NATO treaty, from their expanded understanding of executive power, especially with the help of their lawyers, which is an interesting thing, rather than deliberating with Congress. And I talked about this with my students for years when I was a teacher, and we just seem to engage in all of these wars during the Cold War, and yet never declared war, right? We can rattle all of them off, right? But Korea and Vietnam probably stand out as the most significant wars that we engaged in during the Cold War. So what events are what's taking place during the Cold War to expand this unilateralism, and then doesn't the War Powers Resolution help restore things, or is it supposed to, and it fails? Can you explain that a little bit as well?
Yeah, great questions. And this is, as you say, a turning point, because what we see with FDR is FDR taking power from Congress, right? Congress really trying hard to restrain FDR, really trying to keep him out of, or trying to keep the US out of the war. And once we get to the Cold War, once we get to Truman and then Johnson, we see this is Congress giving away its power, right? This is Congress just saying to the president, you've figured this out, right? You know what you're doing, I guess. We're not going to question you before you start the operation. We're not going to do a lot of oversight while the operations are continuing. We're just going to kind of grumble about it and say, we don't really like what you're doing in Korea, or we don't really like, how it's going in Vietnam. But instead of really putting themselves into it, actually really standing up to the president and saying, we're going to decide whether you're doing a good job, as 19th century Congresses did. The 20th century, or the Cold War Congresses, just kind of stepped back and quietly said to each other, like, should we do something? And like, no, we definitely don't want to do anything here. And then you finally have it come to a head, as you say, with the War Powers Resolution, where it seems as if Congress is finally saying, all right, Nixon was the last straw. We have to do something now. We clearly have this runaway president that Schlesinger calls the imperial presidency. And we've got to act, right? Like the whole country is calling out for us to act, and they really were. So you've got this public pressure for Congress to act, and what they do is come up with the War Powers Resolution. And the first part of the War Powers Resolution reads essentially like a plain reading of the constitutional text. So if you look at the first part of the War Powers Resolution, it's exactly what the founders would have suggested, right? So presidents can't go to war unless they have a declaration, an authorization from Congress, or they're responding to an attack, right? Every single founder would have said, check mark, check mark, check mark. That's exactly what we were talking about. That's exactly what we wanted from the presidency. So go ahead, right? And then this 1970s Congress thinks to itself, well, there's sometimes when presidents are going to do smaller scale operations. So why don't we account for that? So then they have this little door opening moment where they're like, well, if presidents are going to do something by themselves unilaterally, we're going to give them 60 to 90 days. And you're like, no, I'm sorry, Congress. The entire point of your actions here in this War Powers Resolution is to put the genie back in the bottle. Like, you don't want presidents doing things without your permission. And they're still able to respond to a sudden attack. So just stop there, right? That's where it should have ended. But instead, they have this permission slip essentially for the presidency, where they say you've got 60 to 90 days. So I tend to refer to it as like the Top Gun version of wars, right? Where if it's just a few planes flying around, presidents are allowed to do it without congressional sanction, and Congress just kind of says like, okay, do that, and we don't want to be bothered with it. So the War Powers Resolution was supposed to be a constraint and actually acts as a permission slip.
Right, fascinating. So then the Cold War ends, right? But unilateralism doesn't. Okay, and so during this post-Cold War period, and then leading into the War on Terror after 9/11, the presidents really just effectively ignore Congress in either in what are wars, but then also, increasingly they appeal to humanitarian missions, or so-called humanitarian missions. And I think about the wars that I've experienced in my lifetime that you discuss. And so, we had the first Gulf War and Somalia, Kosovo and Bosnia, and then of course Afghanistan, Iraq, and the War on Terror. And so, how does this unilateralism just continue to play out despite this War Powers Resolution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of those moments in US history where I was looking at it for the book, and where the Cold War and the imbalance there kind of felt understandable to me. When you get to the 90s and this sort of like American exceptionalism, end of history, democratic peace theory writ large, I kind of think to myself, did none of you read anything from the founders? Did none of you read like anything from the cycles of history and the fact that like, the hubristic are brought down, right? It always ends badly for them. So you don't want to just go around the world doing whatever it is that you please because you think you've quote unquote won the Cold War. Because first of all, Russia doesn't agree, right, with that reading of the end of the Cold War. And there's going to be lots of places internationally that do not welcome your help, as you quote unquote put it, right? So when you go in with these humanitarian missions, sometimes you're not only not welcome as an actor, but you're also potentially doing more harm. So in Somalia, for example, many of the peacekeepers ended up causing the civil strife there to continue or perpetuate because people were using food that was being provided by the UN to pay their soldiers so that they could continue fighting. And so, these kinds of mistakes are, I suppose, understandable, but this is one of those moments where if there was a balance between the branches, you would see Congress potentially saying to presidents, is it really a good idea for us to go into Somalia guns blazing? Is it really a good idea for us to, insert ourselves into the situation in Bosnia, again, guns blazing? And having more deliberation, more time to talk about these things, rather than just assuming, everyone's going to want US help, everyone's going to want the US military to tell them what to do. It would have been a really good time to recheck and put ourselves, where it is that we should probably be in terms of the balance between the branches and in terms of how we use US power, right? Because what you really want is the US be a source for good, positive change in the world. And if you're using US power kind of willy-nilly in different operations all over the place, that's probably not going to go very well. Right, so you have this moment in the 90s where the US could be this source for positive good in the world, and instead, because they, insert themselves in some conflicts poorly, don't insert themselves in other conflicts like Rwanda, then they don't look like a very good actor. And on top of that, Congress this entire time isn't saying to presidents, no, you have to come to us, you have to ask us prior to doing these things, and you have to tell us why you have to do them and why it's beneficial for US interests, for international security. And presidents just aren't doing this. They're just deciding for themselves. So, it's not even all of the US making these kinds of selective decisions. It's just presidents, right? Essentially Clinton making these selective decisions. And Clinton was so swept up in the idea of democratic peace theory and the idea that if we make the world democratic, then it's going to be a more peaceful world, that we see a sort of reiteration of the Wilsonian problem, where it's like, we're so hubristic, we're so impressed with our own system of government that we're imposing it on a whole bunch of other people, and they do not like it. They really don't see the US as a source for positive change in the world in the 90s for the most part.
Right, so, so my final question. Your book really provides compelling and ample evidence for this constitutional imbalance that has been going on for now over a century over war powers, and I think I detect exasperation on both of our parts for this real constitutional imbalance and what it means for an American democracy, what it means for American power in the world and views of America from around the globe. There's just a lot of troubling aspects of this imbalance of separation of powers and checks and balances. So my question is, what do you think the remedy for restoring this balance with the separation of powers, with checks and balances, with constitutionalism, what is that going to be? And can we get back to that proper balance that Madison and the founders envisioned?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you're right, I am exasperated, and I'm glad to have a fellow exasperated interlocutor to talk to, because it is very frustrating when you see all the things that presidents have consistently done. Just to name a couple of recent examples, we see, Biden hitting a few militia groups in Syria, and we see Trump assassinating a member of the Iranian government when that member happened to be in Iraq. And these are things that can spiral into, if not World War III, some kind of great power war, because if Iran and the US went to blows, Russia would get involved. I suspect China would also get involved, or maybe sit it out and see what happens. But all the same, it would be a major crisis that you don't want to see, and you don't want in the hands of one individual, just deciding how the world international security is going to shake out. So, I think to try and get back to some kind of balance, there's a few things. So I've mentioned several times that I don't think the problem really is the presidency or presidents themselves. It's very understandable from the constitutional perspective that presidents are going to be ambitious, right? The kind of person who decides to run a country is naturally going to be the kind of person who wants to expand his or her power and wants to be viewed as a great president, right? And so that's perfectly understandable. What we need then is for Congress to really reassert itself and really bring the president back into balance with the Congress. And how do you do this exactly? For one thing, I guess a possible way forward would be a change in the leadership in Congress. So if you look at members who are currently in power, so people like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, you don't see them trying to find ways to reassert Congress so much as you see them as trying to find ways to beat out the other party, right? So what you would need is people like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi somehow seeing that their interest is to work together against the presidency, right? And that's not something that we're seeing now, but that's the kind of thing where if the branch had a loyalty to itself and the branch really started working together to counter the ambition of the presidency, that could restore a balance, I would think. And so how would you get them to do that? So the hard answer to that is that it seems like you have to convince voters to vote for that. And so you have to convince voters that Mitch McConnell should want to work with Nancy Pelosi and vice versa, rather than Nancy Pelosi in this instance working with Biden and Biden's administration, or Mitch McConnell working previously with the Trump administration. Unfortunately, voters are currently convinced that they want Republicans to work together against the Democrats and vice versa. So, you know, I think one would hope, and I just had to say on a hopeful term, one would hope that people will start to see that the shirts and skins or like the jersey that you wear is not the way to organize politics. It should be that we have broad goals that we agree on are good or positive for the country, instead of I just want to beat the other guy, right? I don't care what it is that he's voting for. I just want him to lose. And like, I feel like the fever has to break. Like, I feel like we're at a moment in US history where, you know, we are kind of frenzied. We are kind of like, I don't like the other people on the other side. And we've had moments where we've gotten over that, say, for example, post 9/11, there was much more of a sense of camaraderie or a collective sense of the American nation and interest. So maybe we can get back to that. Maybe COVID, because of the fact that we are all in this together, could be a moment like that where we come together and realize we have to work together. We can't work against the other team. The other thing I would say is you have to have perhaps the greatest of statesmen in the Oval Office, because they would willingly give up a great deal of unilateral power and willingly force Congress, by ushering through legislation, willingly force Congress to bring them back into balance, right? So to sort of to summarize, you need Congress to start working as a branch against the presidency, which is good constitutionally. It sounds like it's bad, but it's good. Or you would need a president who willingly puts more shackles on his power or her power and forces Congress to take some of the power that has been collected into the executive branch.
All right, Sarah Burns, thank you for joining us. The book is The Politics of War Powers, the Theory and History of Presidential Unilateralism. Really a remarkable book. One of those books that, you know, provides answers to some of those questions you've just had in your mind for years and years and years about the American political system and constitutional order, and now they're answered. So thank you very much for your remarkable book and for coming to speak with me today.
Thanks so much, Tony. It was really enjoyable, and I, hope we have future conversations, maybe at some point in person.
Yes, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We put out new material on U.S. history and civics every Tuesday and Thursday, including primary source close reads, scholar talks like this one, and also homework help videos for students. Also, please come check us out on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, other social media, and join the conversation and see the ways that you can get involved with BRI. Thank you.